Tonight on The Readout.
A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never be able to ease the people's love of liberty. Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
President Biden gets a raucous welcome in Poland, vowing that a united NATO will never abandon Ukraine, while Vladimir Putin tries to justify his disastrous war to the Russian people. Meanwhile, the pro-insurrectionist caucus in the House would very much like to see Ukraine lose. One tweeting, quote, "Ukraine is not our friend and Russia is not our enemy." Plus, the forewoman says the Georgia special grand jury looking into Trump's plot to overturn the 2020 election recommended multiple indictments, and that list is not short. Good evening, everyone. Jason Johnson in for Joy Reid, and we are just days away from the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of a sovereign country, Ukraine. And today, President Biden, standing in front of the Royal Castle, a historical landmark in Warsaw that was rebuilt after another invading force, the Nazis, destroyed it, framed this fight against Russia as a larger battle against autocracy.
President Putin is confronted with something today that he didn't think was possible a year ago. The democracies of the world have grown stronger, not weaker. But the autocrats of the world have grown weaker, not stronger.
Grossly underestimated the NATO alliance.
One year into this war, Putin no longer doubts the strength of our coalition, but he still doubts our conviction. He doubts our staying power. He doubts our continued support for Ukraine. He doubts whether NATO can remain unified. But there should be no doubt. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire. President Putin's craven lust for land and power will fail.
And he reminded Putin that all of this would actually end if Putin would withdraw his occupying forces.
This war is never a necessity. It's a tragedy. President Putin chose this war. Every day the war continues is his choice. He could end the war with a word.
A few hours earlier, Putin delivered a dystopian speech riddled with lies, claiming that Russia was the real victim in their invasion of Ukraine.
We're not fighting in Ukraine. We said that the Ukrainian people have become hostages of their Western masters who occupied this country in political, in economic and military sense. The elites of the West are not hiding their goals. They are, as they say, trying to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia.
Also, they're liberators. Where have we heard that before? It was Russian forces that actually invaded Ukraine a year ago, using a string of justifications that keep literally blowing up in Putin's face. First, it was to save Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Then Russian-speaking Ukrainians took up arms against his invading army. Then it was to denazify Ukraine, but Putin himself is the grand wizard of global right-wing movements. Some of Russia's more candid political leaders have admitted it's a war of genocide. But not even that has worked, because the Russian people domestically have protested against a war that they see domestically as costly and pointless. Putin initially assumed that his invasion would be Russia's version of Desert Storm, maybe a month of combat before he could claim victory in front of the Duma. Now, a year later, it's more like his Afghanistan. And a sign of just how bad things are for the Russian military, the founder of the Russian mercenary group, the mercenary Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has launched a very vocal broadside against the Russian military, accusing them of failing to properly arm Putin's forces. Today, Putin announced he would suspend Russia's participation in the new START nuclear non-proliferation agreement, the last remaining arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, charting a dangerous path ahead for U.S.-Russia relations, and one that could bring us closer to the Cold War than ever before. Joining me now is William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He is currently vice president for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and Nayar Haq, former White House senior director and former State Department senior advisor. Nayar, I'll start with you. I I don't get happy when I hear this is returning us to the Cold War. I get concerned when I hear that Russia wants to pull out of a non-proliferation agreement. How serious is it? I mean, I know that apparently this deal was already on its last legs, but how serious a move is it that Russia has said, yeah, now we're not even going to bother with inspectors for nuclear weapons?
Well, they are saying out loud what they have been acting on behind the scenes, by and large. They have not allowed verification, which was a key part of verifying that both countries are reducing their nuclear arsenal. But it goes to the broader idea of Putin just doing away with the Western sense of alliances, the post-World War II order in which Russia was on the side of the Allies. Right. And Putin framing, now it's him and African countries, even with the foreign minister going to Africa and talking about the hypocrisy of the West. So we're seeing this very interesting realignment while Putin internally is a propaganda machine. The people of Russia don't see what the rest of us are seeing, what you were mentioning, what's happening in Ukraine. And this is the first time in the speech that Putin ever mentioned the word war when talking about the one-year conflict that he instigated in Ukraine. So the people of Russia are not in a great place, and Putin is trying to normalize the idea of talking about nuclear weapons and having nuclear weapons because he does not have much left.
Ambassador, you know, one of the major concerns that I have also is that this next step, if Vladimir Putin does not have an escape hatch, it's been a year, this is likely to be a conflict that will continue for a while. If Russia doesn't have an escape hatch and their conventional forces don't seem to be working very well anymore, then nuclear weapons might be the only option he sees. How concerned is the U.S. government about that right now? And are there negotiation options on the table to maybe ratchet this conflict down?
Jason, there are not negotiation options on the table right now. There may be sometime in the future. And it will depend on President Putin understanding, coming to the conclusion that he can't win on the battlefield. Then he might sit down. That's why we have to support the Ukrainians as they push back, as they push way back. So this is the issue, Jason. The question is the support for Ukraine, allowing them to push the Russians out of their nation. All the Ukrainians are after is the Russians out of their country. As you indicated, as you described at the beginning, the Russians invaded in 2014 and then invaded massively in 2022. They have an option. The off-ramp, the exit ramp for Putin is to just pull out. He's got 11 times. He's not bottled up. Right. His back is not to the wall. He's got a big country. He doesn't need Ukraine. Jason, he lived without Crimea since 1954. He doesn't need Crimea. So yes, he can stop this anytime, and he can begin the negotiations on that basis. I think on that basis, the Ukrainians would be happy. They've said they'd be happy to negotiate at that time.
Nair, so this is the one that also gets me. You know, there are lots of people in the international left and sort of international peace advocates who've said, you know what? We would have already had a peace deal on the table, but America and the West, they want this to be a proxy war now. And it's not the same thing as parroting Putin's talking points. There are people who said, hey, look, you could give up this bit of land, you could move people here and there. This war only exacerbates conflict in the region. Is there legitimacy to that? Is there a legitimacy to the argument that now Ukraine might be so far into this and the West and NATO are so far into it that realistic diplomatic options are no longer on the table?
It's fascinating to see the left unite with Henry Kissinger when it comes to foreign policy issues, particularly with Ukraine, because suddenly the human rights and the genocide of Ukrainians is not the #1 driving issue. It's the idea of the United States not engaging militarily, the United States pulling back from alliances, and it raises the question of what is all that military spending for? What is NATO? What are all these alliances for if at the end of the day, the United States is not going to stand up for the very principles it created. It's, the United States is the only country that's actually activated the NATO alliance for a military conflict that was a threat to the United States. Biden's been very careful and very forceful of making this about a conflict for Ukraine and the defense of Ukraine's democracy, and not about NATO and Russia. That's Putin's language.
Right.
He wants this to be this grander conflict. He wants this to be a peace discussion on his terms, where he gets to carve off pieces of a sovereign country. And Ambassador Taylor is right. He can walk out any minute if his psychology and his ego would let him do that.
I have to say, Ambassador, one of the things that's been interesting is the rhetoric that we're hearing from Russia. They're getting awful bellicose for people who seem to be backed into a corner. But, everybody gets really, really tough when they realize that they may actually be losing. I want to play this sound right now about the Russians saying that they allowed Biden to go to Kiev and to go to Warsaw, and then get your thoughts on the other side.
Значит, вот этот визит также подтверждает, вы знаете, что мы абсолютно правы. Мы цивилизованная страна. Байден приехал в Киев, потому что, уверен, он получил гарантии безопасности.
So basically what we're seeing here is that President Biden went to the Ukraine, went to Warsaw, because he was trying to make a point that, look, the United States supports the independence of these countries, and no, Poland will not be next on Russia's list. And the Russians have decided to frame that as, hey, we let you go here. We didn't have to let you in. When you see that sort of thing, Ambassador, is it clear that Russia is just in the propaganda mode of trying to cover their own sort of weakness when it comes to this conflict? Or was that a real threat? Was it really the assumption that if you guys tried that again, if you send other representatives, we might actually attack them or shoot them down?
Jason, total propaganda. Total propaganda. I mean, you get those talk shows. You know about talk shows.
Right.
And people can say whatever they want. That is a strange one right there. But let me go back to Naya's point. I think she's exactly right to raise the issue of genocide, to raise the issue of war crimes, of atrocities. What the Russians are doing in Ukraine is horrible. It is horrible. And to suggest that the Ukrainians ought to just give up some of the land, give up some territory where Ukrainians live, knowing what happens when the Russians occupy that. What part of the United States would we want to give up? That's what Ukrainians are asking. They're not eager at all to give up their own territory where their citizens live, knowing what happens to those citizens. So that's what they're fighting for. They're fighting for democracy. They're fighting for human rights. And that's why we're supporting them.
Ambassador William Taylor and Nayyar Haq, thank you so much for starting us off on the Readout today.